on the grass after this because it's such nice weather. So we've got a reasonably busy agenda this evening and quite a lot of us in this smaller room, so we won't make it last any longer than we really have to, but don't let that stop some good quality debate, as I always like to point out. Just going through the agenda for timings, minutes, declarations of interest, probably questions, we have not received any, so we'll whiz through that quite quickly. Progress update, I think we'll take 5 minutes to go through any issues or any items anybody would like to be raised. The committee's work programme, I know there's a little bit of discussion or questions around there, so we'll take 10 minutes for that. Item 6, which is items identified from the forward plan. I've allowed 5 minutes each, but 25 minutes overall, which can be stretched a little bit because I know that's a pre-decision scrutiny. And the council constitution, which may be exciting for most of us, I'm allowed 15 minutes, but may go a bit longer. Then obviously any members' questions is 15 minutes as well. So. Confirm the minutes as a true record of the meeting held on the 12th of April 2022. Do I have a proposer and a seconder? Yeah, thank you. Take your pick from any of those. There we go. Any declarations of interest on today's agenda? Yeah, Councillor Medland.
Is that working okay? Yep. My mother's a client of White Care, so I'm just mention that.
Councillor Jarman, Councillor Palin and Councillor Ishoni.
That one, that's it, Chris. Keep your finger on it. That's it, now take it off. That's it.
Good, we're live. So just to declare a pecuniary interest that my dad has is under a care plan from the Isle of Wight Council. He was under White Care, he no longer is, but he's still under a care plan from the Isle of Wight Council.
Cameron.
In regards to 6A, I'm a local authority employee at a local school.
Councillor J.
I'm a PA for the PA Notice Board and clients obviously use White Care.
Thank you. Did you get all of those? Yep. Excellent. No questions, I believe, from the members of the public. So that takes us nicely on to item 4, progress update. So those of you that have read it several times overnight, or since you've got the agenda, anything in matters arising or any issues from the progress update? Take that as noted, but please feel free if you, before I move on, if there's anything you want to shout out. We do go over it every time, so it should be familiar to most people. Item 5, the committee's work programme forward plan. So this is, first of all, we need to agree what we want on the next meeting in June. There are a couple of other spaces or space on there. Something I'd like to ask as well is, because of the deferment of the island plan, we do need to come up with a date or agree which meeting that will then come back to. And I believe we will have the quarter performance year-end figures as for corporate scrutiny will be on the next meeting. Is that right, Paul? That's correct. Yeah, which will form part of the agenda for them. So anything else on the forward plan? No? Oh, this might be another record meeting. In terms of date for the draft for the island plan to come back, do we have anybody that can give us a steer on that? So we Councillor Fuller, so we'll need to write to Councillor Fuller and ask him when it's coming back. Okay.
Chair,
yes, Councillor Spink.
On that matter, is it possible for this committee to recommend that it ought not to come back to Cabinet before it has been served on corporate scrutiny for 1 month prior to the Cabinet meeting? In my submission, it's very important to avoid the chaos that took place last time. And the only way that that can be done, I would suggest, is by corporate scrutiny having a month in which to properly read the papers, consider questions and report. And if it's going to come back with just 5 days notice again, it really is simply repeating in my submission the shambles that took place last time.
Good question. Anyone in the room able to offer Councillor Spink any advice on that? No, that's a question we need to take away.
Chairman, I can write to Councillor Fuller on both points about the date and about the the advance notice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Spink. Anything else on the forward plan or indeed the work programme? Yes, Councillor Lee. Don't break it.
The review of the public health partnership function between Isle of Wight Council and Hampshire County Council, which is going to Cabinet in 16th of June. Is there a health scrutiny committee before that date?
Chairman, I can confirm it will be looked at by House Scrutiny before it goes back to Cabinet.
Okay, thank you. It therefore doesn't need to be brought to this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else from anybody? No. We'll move on to item 6. Now, Councillor Andre is due shortly, I believe, so we'll miss out item A and come back to that to give people a fair chance to question Councillor Andre when she arrives. So starting with point B, to treat the Wild Heart Trust, formerly Sandown Zoo, as a special purchaser for an area of council land adjacent to the site. And I'm sure many of you in that area have a view on this, so I don't know if the Cabinet member responsible would like to give us a quick overview, or if you'd just like to address questions. Just address questions?
Happy to take it. Sorry. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Okay. Councillor Quirk.
At a previous meeting when we were discussing this site, there was an assurance given by the Cabinet that any proposal for the Carver site would be taken out to consultation across the whole of the bay. Would that occur in this case?
I wasn't aware that there was an agreement to take it out to all of the bay for public consultation. I think it's been discussed with various partners in the area at some length. This isn't a new proposal, and indeed we're not actually at this stage making any final decision on it. This is simply to decide whether we accept this one potential acquirer of the site as a preferred bidder. It's not to decide anything further than that single point.
Is it just as a preferred bidder, or are we giving them special terms? Otherwise, is it that we were talking about offering special terms for them, whereas other charitable tourism businesses in the same area have had to pay full market rate for properties that they've acquired?
So, again, it's not to define any terms at this stage, it's simply to acknowledge their status as the preferred organisation with which we will engage going forwards. If there are any other organisations that might seek to engage, we haven't identified that interest at the moment. There are a lot of reasons why, as a preferred bidder, they would be afforded that status, which are defined, I think, quite clearly in the paper, in terms of their adjoining nature, in terms of the value they represent to the economy of the area. It seems to be fairly obvious that they would have an interest in it, and I think the lack of anyone else coming forward should be judged accordingly.
I think listening to both what Councillor Quirk and Councillor Chandler said is I think it will be important to take a view as if we were a member of the public for the Bay, and whether we'd be happy. What we need to avoid in this committee is just make pre-approval, as it were, and avoid getting too excited about these things. I think individually we probably think it's a great idea, but I think it's very important that it does show that we've done due process. So as it moves forward, what will the process be, Councillor Jarman, from here? Where do we know when we've got to a position where the land will be allocated?
So that will be the next phase that we enter into. There will be those negotiations and those discussions, and those will be on the normal commercial terms. We're not looking at anything preferential here, other than identifying this as a preferred bidder into the discussion. So everything follows as normal. It's simply the status that they will have in those discussions.
Okay, any other questions? Councillor Lilly.
It's more of a comment than a question. I think the importance for me is that you have an existing organisation that's actually an existing important provider for tourism, but also doing something important for ecology as well. And I think, to me, we should be looking at helping our assets, right, on the island and building on those, right, first before we actually bring things from outside, because they're here and they're known, and we should be supporting their growth, because that basically means more jobs. If you're actually able to develop, you have more employment. That has spin-off because people more come to that area, and then that has an effect. So I think that it is important that the principle, right, of actually looking at our homegrown, right, and developing that. We're not talking about an organisation that is unknown to that. I was a child on the island, in the 60s and 70s, and actually saw tigers on the beach from there. So it's been there for a very long time, and it is part of our culture in this community. So being a facilitating council, I think is extremely important to listen to the growth plans of existing organisations that have particularly where they have a unique selling point within that. So I would definitely support this going to the next stage. Totally agree with you, your point, that we need to scrutinise, and we need to, for things to come back. But for this stage, I actually think we should do that. And I would think that the organisation itself has a duty to communicate with others in the Bay Area. And if I was going to recommend anything, was that we encourage them to take the community with them.
Well, thank you, Councillor Lilly. We've got Councillor Evans via the miracle of technology. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to answer Councillor Quirk's question, because I think it was me that promised there'd be the wider consultation with the Bay. That was really for any sort of large scale redevelopment of the site, following on from the Dinosaur Isle decision last summer. So this is only a very, very small piece of land at the back of the Wild Heart Trust. So it's not that big and wide scale, tourism offer, whatever may or may not happen there. But completely agree with Councillor Lilly there. This is such an asset to the whole Bay Area. In fact, the Isle of Wight, what they're doing here is very, very good, not only for their industry, but also for the Isle of Wight as a tourism offer there. So just wanted to back that up. But yeah, this is all part of consultation as well, isn't it? Discussing it in public. So that was helpful. That was all. I'll go now.
Thank you, Councillor Jones Evans. Any other further comments or questions? I think I'll just reiterate that it does need to be shown as a member of the public would see this as a fair and equitable decision, however it's made. That it doesn't look like, I get its preferred bidder status, but I think we have to be very careful what that means if a similar situation arises for another tourist-based business and they don't enjoy the same privilege. We could, as a council, find ourselves in a little bit bother. So, okay, moving on then, we'll go on to item C. Councillor Stevens, time in the spotlight. Hackney Carriage Table of Fares.
Fantastic. You no doubt all read the press release which was issued last week with regards to this. It was during a consultation. Every year our Isle of Wight Council staff consult with the trade. One, to make sure it's feeling good about things. Two, are there any problems on the horizon? And three, to make sure that there is value for money for our residents. With the way that the consultation came about last autumn, there was a general consensus that within the trade, they would like to see an increase, and the increase is up to the certain amount. It doesn't say that it's got to be that amount, and indeed it is only a question of actually changing the machinery that actually records the fare. So if a taxi driver wants to charge up to and including the full amount per unit, then he's entitled to do so. If he doesn't wish to, he doesn't have to. There's no return in recompense financially to the Isle of Wight Council for undergoing this duty. So we as a local authority are just undertaking what the trade is wanting to put in place. And whether or not the taxi trade had foresight, noting the cost of fuel at this present time, it's quite fortuitous that some aren't going to the wall or won't be going to the wall if they can increase their fare. But as I say, this is voluntarily undertaken by the taxi trade themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. Any questions or comments? Councillor Lilly, didn't disappoint.
Can I just ask the question, Councillor Stevens, and the press release was a very good one, so thank you for that. What's the consultation? Is there any sort of body for the customers? Is there any, obviously for buses you have customer forums and side. Is there such a body for taxi customers?
No such combined body, but what I would say is that individual taxi proprietors and companies come together. Our licensing and regulatory services persons understand and know who they are, and direct approaches are made to the various bodies. But taxi driving with individual companies, as you know, is sometimes a competitive business, and therefore sometimes they don't come together as a body. And any further than that I can't say, because obviously if they do get together, they don't come together to meet with us as per the bus users group, etc., etc.
Thank you. I'll come back after questions with a comment. Thank you.
You might not. Councillor Drew.
Presumably the fares they're a matter of public record, I'm assuming. Is that the case?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do we publish them at the moment on the website? I was just thinking perhaps we can help the public to compare things a little bit more effectively when we have this varying pricing strategy.
Have you seen the press release, Councillor Drew? And have you seen that there's a note down here per 5 mile journey, etc.? So there is something that has been put out from us. Obviously, when someone gets into a hackney carriage, there is also the display of the pricing structure, and therefore the maximum is displayed. As I said, if someone is feeling benevolent, then they can give someone a free journey if they wish. There is nothing to stop a taxi driver from giving Councillor Warren Drew a free journey any more than it would be to provide the maximum which is displayed in the hackney carriage.
Thank you, Councillor Seeley. I think the point was just generally the way that we publicise that to assist the general payer. So I think if that's clear and transparent, then that's great.
It most certainly is.
Councillor Early, did you want to? Bear in mind you're on the meter. So.
I think it's a difficult one in the sense that, I mean, if you look at some of the objections, for some people, because of poor other transport, taxis are the only means that they can actually get to hospital appointments and various things. I mean, we do have Optima voluntary drivers, But at the same time, taxi drivers is a profession which is very important to many families on this island, and many people at the end of their career, or you know, where other work have gone, actually go into taxi driving, and so it is a very important income. In my ward, there were a number of taxi drivers parked in front of houses, and that's the sole income that goes into that family. And they work very long hours, right? At times which we would find very difficult on a Friday night in Newport arrive and taking people. So it's a very difficult one. On the one hand, you know, people on the island, you know, don't need fares going up, but at the same time, with all the costs, the taxi drivers, as Councillor Stevens, to go out to business. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't in this situation. And I think at the end of the day, they can make the decision, as Councillor Stevens have had. And I think it's more of how do we look at other schemes or whatever that perhaps can actually support the customers who, you know, are going to be hit by this. But if we don't do this, a lot of families will be hit as well. It's a very emotive subject, really.
Thank you. Councillor Love.
Thank you.
So it's just going you need to get a microphone for those at home.
My apologies, Chair. I didn't really intend to speak, but just whilst you was sat there talking, I was wondering about whether there was any thought about ever having a discretionary rate for people with reduced mobilities as a way forward. That was just going through my mind while I was sitting here, and whether that might be considered perhaps in the future.
Yeah.
We regulate most things and probably over-regulate at certain times. If and there is a burden on our social care services and the very infrastructure. What I would say is that we had a bit of a sad tale this week when our when we referred to government under a grant funding scheme and we refused £100,000. Had we had that £100,000, then we would have actually enhanced our public transport link. So I don't want to tinker with private individuals' workings and indeed their business and their companies. It's tough. It's a tough life out there anyway. But if government had actually looked at the Isle of Wight and seen the situation here, then quite possibly we might have been evaluated in a different way. But there's always next time for that. But I don't want to interfere with the regulating and fares of individual taxi drivers and indeed the trade as a whole. Thank you.
Councillor Paley.
Just on this, in relation to the increase, has the administration and the council taken into account? Obviously, we have, you know, large numbers of children that may need to get to school via taxi. I know, you know, several. Has that been taken into account within the budget just to assure that's, you know, all fully covered and doesn't affect anything?
Yes, it has. And I can assure you that every child that needs a taxi will, I don't talk across chamber, we will not allow our children's education to suffer. So children will get to school, and that doesn't matter whether it's Ian Stevens, Chris Quirk or Michael Liddy. We will all, as a council, make sure that our children get to their place of education and get the best possible education that they can on this island. Thank you.
Okay, any final questions or comments on carriage fares? No? Marvellous. So we'll come back to your point A shortly, Councillor Andre, but moving on to White Care Business Unit Business Model Development. Any questions or comments? There must be some. Come on. I have a concern, and this isn't a recommendation, but I have a concern that if the cost of providing the service doesn't meet the actual cost, we will lose it. And that from what I gather, everybody that uses it says it's an excellent service. So I do appreciate there is some need for the cost to go up. I don't know what other people think around the table. Councillor Lilly.
I think it's one of the sad realities, and I think you just support your words, Councillor Quigley, in a sense. If we don't wake up to the realities of the costs and costs going up, we could lose the service. I think that I have talked to people who use white care, and I think it's the way you communicate to your, in a sense, customers, right? That, you know, through that dialogue, people will agree to costs going up if they can actually see they're getting value for money and a quality service. And I think that there is in this case. I think it's just important. We have to be pragmatic, and we have to have reality within that. It is an excellent service, but we've got to actually make sure that it's not subsidised irrationally. It needs to have a clear direction of development in the future, right? And it has to pay its way. Again, it's one of those things you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I think it's probably the mantra of the council at this time with it. But I support the recommendation.
Councillor Paley.
I agree with much of what Michael just said. I just wonder whether, as part of the review, we need to reconsider rationale behind the council's provision of services. Obviously, how it relates to other independent services now that are contracted out, like the Living Well scheme, early help scheme, and things like that. I wonder whether that needs to, all be incorporated as part of this review.
I've got Councillor Mead and then Councillor Spink.
Thank you, Chair. I support the paper. I just want to make the general point that what concerns me is that the rate that inflation is increasing at the moment, it seems we need more than 1 year sort of price setting routine. This applies to several papers here, doesn't it, really? That we are in such a crazy situation this year of hyperinflation we haven't seen since the 1970s. Very unpredictable levels, and if it's going like 5, 10, 15% or something, we need to have some sort of, I think we need to have an alternative, some other structure, an annual budget structure to be able to, otherwise we can be potentially losing huge amounts of money, and it does worry me. The budgetary situation really concerns me at the moment with falling income from unpaid taxes and the increase in our expenditure from the inflation, particularly of energy prices.
Okay, Councillor Spink.
Thank you, Chair. What I was going to raise has to some extent been raised by Councillor Medland. I think I'm right in saying, from having read the report a little while ago, that the last review or increase was in 2018. And I would suggest that the increases should be at least annual, or if not annual, perhaps even more than that, so that people aren't faced with a huge increase to make up for, as it were, the past 3 or 4 years. The other thing, and perhaps I should know the answer to this, but I don't. I mean, if people, cost of living's going up, and for a lot of people it means that they simply won't be able to afford this service. And I think I'm right in saying, but I'd be happy to be corrected, that there's no form of individual subsidy that someone can apply for the service based on their means. So whilst it does have to pay for itself, I fully accept that. Is there any form of subsidy for the more lowly paid people who have a genuine need for the service?
Councillor John.
So quite a few questions there. I was trying to give a mental note as they were running up. So first of all, to do them almost in reverse order, and I'll leave it to Laura if she wants to add anything to it. That yes, there is indeed a means tested element to the scheme. Just broadly, to leave it at that. I think if you want to know any more details about how that breaks down, I'm happy to go through it with you. I think I understand it quite well now. Laura's been very helpful in providing details as we've gone along. The second thing is that yes, inflationary pressures are impacting all the services that we do with the council, and Whitecare is not exceptional in that regard. It is only exceptional because there was a mechanism put into place for annual review of the pricing of the scheme, and that was effectively suspended some years ago, and has resulted in an increasing deficit building up in the scheme, so that it is now funded effectively to the tune of about 36% from other resources in adult social care. And it is very reasonable to argue that it does need to stand on its own 2 feet, and for us not to take scarce and equally needed funds from the front line of adult social care and use it to subsidise this scheme. If we look going forwards on it, I'll admit, going back to the earlier question before that, that it is a very worthwhile scheme and is something that many people on the island depend on. My father, until just a few weeks ago, was one of those people, and there are other people here whose family also depend on it. And indeed, maybe one day, many of us will need to depend on this or a similar scheme in its own right in our latter years. We always hope to be independent, but that's not something that any of us can guarantee. So as we go forwards, the next stage is going to be a business analysis of the future of Whitecare, and it will be an options analysis. Clearly, there are options to truncate the services that it provides, and there are some of those which are useful on a statutory basis, and many of them are optional services. I don't favour that. I'll be very upfront about that. I think there are options to extend the service to other facilities. One of them that I very much like, for example, is extending some of the home monitoring, so that rather than people opening their front door to strangers, we can have an on-behalf monitoring service with perhaps a doorbell and a camera that works that way. There are indeed services that do that today, and we could embrace that. But I think what we need to do is to look at all the options for this going forward, something that gets it. We are not looking for this to become a profit centre within the council. We are looking for this to effectively wash its face and to break even, so that it does not demand funding from the core fund of adult social care, which is itself under enormous pressure and is likely to become under more pressure going forwards. So this needs to be self-sustaining, and it's a question of how do we get it back on its own 2 feet.
Councillor Leachman and then Councillor Love.
I work with people that use this service, and so there's 2 things for me: education and engagement with people. So I just want to talk about something else, really, that a lot of people don't see the value in it, and so they'll be happy to call an ambulance instead of calling for help, and actually that's putting a strain. So I think we just need to do a slightly better job of getting the reason why people should have it. And that includes carers and people in there every day, even by testing it so they can hear somebody at the other end. It's very important, but totally agree with this.
Councillor Love.
Thank you, Chair. Whitecare, it is a discretionary service that's been developed over the years, and it does actually save us quite a lot of money in terms of re-ablement. It's not just about what's being paid into the service, but it saves us in other areas. It's a service which operates 24 hours a day. It's 365 days even, a year service. It services about 2,200 people, and it's an essential service. The fact is that the pressures which we talk about are inflicted upon us by government, who continue to cut all of our funding right across the board. We cannot sustain services at the rates that we currently are when we have £3 million to save this year, £3 million to save next year, and £3 million the year after. It is not sustainable. And this is a service which supports many of our most vulnerable. I don't want to see this service myself go out into the public sector. I think it's a really valuable service. And the point of having local government is to look after our most vulnerable people in the community, irrespective of what their costs are. There's no such thing within adult social care as a free service. Everybody pays a little bit of something into adult social care. The fact is that we cannot continue as we are. The costs were frozen, as you've already heard, in 2018, and they haven't been increased since then. And it's with a heavy heart that we increase them now, to be fair, but we cannot continue as we are. And so those are the points that I particularly wanted to make there, and it's with some regret and a heavy heart that we do have to seek to increase those costs. And where individuals are identified who are struggling to pay their costs, we would encourage them to come forward and identify themselves, so that we can then at least try to provide some kind of intervention and support there. I think that some good points have been raised here, but it's about how we identify those people. In fact, we actually identified that we believe that the service is consistently, it's still operating more or less at the same levels as 2015, with about 2,200 people. There's no evidence that from previous council rises that people drop out of the service, but now is the most difficult time that I think that this council has ever faced, in terms of 20% up cost, in terms of fuel costs and energy costs, and of course inflation expected to hit 9% by the end of the year. So we are pretty much in a territory where we've never been before, and we need to try to project what it is that we will need in the future. I'm not personally in favour of having twice a year increases, because I think that destabilises it from my point of view, but we may have to look at all options as we move forward.
Thank you. Back to Councillor Spink's question. My Garment assistant, Mr. Thistlewood, has reminded me that fees and charges is as a policy is on the work plan for future. So if we remember that, that's something to come back to and discuss it around then. And then just one last question from me is, what is the, Councillor, if you know off the top of your head, what's the average price increase per week per customer averagely from these increases? Or is it too difficult to say?
I couldn't do that without having...
I mean, it's not £20 a week or £30 a week, it's single digits pounds a week, I guess.
It's single digits. Could I refer you to my director if that's possible?
Well, yeah, please do, Laura.
Single digit.
Yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of the increase, it is pence rather than tens of pounds. The biggest increase comes in terms of the response service, which will see an uplift which is more significant in the region of £3 over the monthly period. So it is managed. And just to feedback, if I may, in relation to Councillor Jarman's comment and the specific question around means testing, my department's job is to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged by virtue of their income to accessing social care. While social care isn't free, as health is, there is a robust framework in place to ensure that everyone has access to the care and support that they need. That involves a full financial assessment, which is absolutely available to any member of our community, whether they access white care, care and support through commission services, or care and support that they pay for themselves. So that remains our offer to support anyone as part of this process.
Thank you. Anything else, of course, we move on to the next topic? Jolly good. Item E, 6E, bereavement service business unit, business model development. Is that you again, Councillor Steve? No, it's Councillor Jarman. Councillor Jarman. You nearly copped for that one, then.
No. So again, here we're concentrating very specifically on the payment elements. I think all the other elements of the service were dealt with earlier in the discussions. So turning to the pages, you'll have arrived this evening and found that there was another piece of paper waiting for you. I was becoming rather dismayed at the number of pieces of paper we seem to generate. But one of them relates to the burial fees, and that's not changed at all, so that really didn't need to be presented this evening. The second piece of paper you've been presented with is the one headed as cremations. I should point out that the only figure that was supposed to have been recalculated here this evening was the only error that page actually contained, which was that on the original document, when they applied the uplift was not supposed to be applied to two figures. One of those was the figure relating to the live streaming, because it's a new figure, just introduced. So that was corrected in this paper. The other one, it was not to be applied to the direct cremation charge, which it was in error. So in correcting the figure for reprinting this evening, the only difference you should have found, and me too, when we arrived, was that this page should have been reprinted, but with the direct cremation charge put at 450. So we will correct that properly again, and I would encourage you to take the two pieces of paper you got this evening and dispose of them accordingly. And I apologise for that. We did have a meeting this afternoon to go through those, and I thought that was quite clear. I think it was, and I think it's just simply applying a calculation to the whole column rather than to one figure. It happens. The issue here is a very similar one to with Whitecare, that this service needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. Bereavement services is not just the line item that refers to direct cremation charges. It is a business unit of the council, and it does include a number of things which are related to bereavement, including the management, of course, of the churchyards that we have, and the burial fees associated in those, but also the maintenance of those facilities even when they have no remaining burial capacity left. We do have to maintain them. And so there are a range of costs which are built into this area of a business. There are also a range of fees that we charge for those, some of which we can charge, for example, for providing cremation facilities, but some of which we cannot pass on in terms of the maintenance of older and no longer in service burial sites on the island. So in the round, we are looking to, again, bring this to some degree of equilibrium in the costs. And it may be that when we look at this model going forwards, because there will now be an all options business analysis of this unit, that we will look at moving fees from one area to another to try and lighten the burden as much as we possibly can on those who find themselves in very distressed circumstances. That's certainly our endeavour, and we're certainly looking to minimise the burden that we provide on people at that very troubling time. So all I can do is leave it open now to see if there are any further questions on the paper.
Certainly, Councillor Rodney.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Jarman. Just quite a simple question from RD. With the increase in cremation charges, would you see an increase in going over to burials? And is there enough sites with consecrated ground where other burial sites have become full? Would you have capacity there? Thank you.
We can leave, Chairman. So through the chair. There is a limited capacity. We also have a number of options available for us, and I think all those options will be looked at in the business model going forwards. Not only the capacity of the sites we've got, but full utilisation of other things. For example, the burials at sea capacity that we have, and within the team, other forms of disposal of remains. I know this is not an issue which affects us alone as a council. Every council is affected by the same series of situations which have unfolded. Clearly, with cremations specifically, we are aware that the price of the gas that we pay is a commercial levy and is therefore not protected by the cap, which domestic supplies are. We've already seen our gas price per unit rise from 3 to 14 pence. It's likely to rise much further later in the year. Of course, we don't know exactly what that is at the moment, and we will need a mechanism within the business unit plan to deal with those rises. They're very difficult to predict. If I was able to predict them, I'd probably be trading on the market at the moment rather than sitting here. But I cannot predict them, and we will need to be responsive to them. So I think specifically on your question, the burial fees, we are trying to maintain them at a reasonable level that affords us the income that we need to sustain that management of that service. The same is true on the cremation and disposal side of the equation, that we are trying to be very mindful of those fees as well. And our capacity in all forms is limited. We've not yet introduced any of the more innovative ideas about disposal, which some elements on the mainland have been considering, but I'm sure during the business analysis that we do, all options will be considered.
Am I on, Chairman?
Indeed.
You spoke about other methods, Councillor Jarman. Could you enlarge on those on the Monday? Thank you.
Please do, Councillor Jarman.
Yes, I could.
Wouldn't you?
No, it's fair to do so. I wouldn't want to be distressing in how I describe them, but there are other ways of dealing with human remains in terms of using various liquids and chemical treatments.
Perhaps I should have not asked that question, so perhaps you shouldn't continue further. Thank you. I do apologise to this.
Thank you, Councillor Dan, I appreciate that. Any further questions on the bereavement service business and flood unit? What's the actual percentage terms increase in terms of a general information cost of a general cost? What's the actual increase, Councillor Jarman?
So there isn't a general figure, is the right answer. With the direct cremation charge, we've kept to the absolute lowest possible. So in fact, that's reduced over the last year. And what we have done is provided at this stage only an inflationary rise on the other charges related to cremation activities, with the exception, of course, of introducing the streaming fee, which is in itself very competitive with what we've got on the mainland. Going forwards, I wouldn't want to prejudge what the business analysis will come out with. There will be a number of considerations in that, and I've no doubt at all that the actual price of the gas will be one of the major driving factors on that. Now, clearly, if we were to look at going from what we've already gone to from 3 to 14 pence per unit, that's a fourfold increase in the price. If we were to apply that simply to the cremation activity, that would be seen as a draconian increase, probably an unsustainable increase as a single leap. If we were to imagine a price per unit at the end of the year, which is, I look at the forecasts and I see figures which are up in the upper 20s per unit, moving from 3 pence to something in the high 20s within a 12-month calendar period is itself a large 9 or 10-fold increase per unit. Now, that isn't the only cost which goes into the cremation charges. It is a model, but it is a substantial element of that cost. So the analysis needs to be done. There are a number of critical factors that it needs to consider, not only price, but also the options we have available to us. There are some councils which are choosing at the moment a model of outsourcing the activity, and there are some councils who are upscaling their facilities and providing a resource for the direct cremation agencies operating 24 hours a day to get economies of scale. I think all options will be considered.
Okay, thank you. Any last question, Councillor Littleton?
When you do the work on the model, will you be able to provide in the future comparative pricing from similar authorities? Because that actually would then be useful when we're actually making sort of judgment to actually know what other authorities are charging and providing.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to do that. I would add a caveat that as we are doing the analysis, they will be doing the financial analysis as well. And it may be difficult for me to align the timing of our outturn from our financial analysis with the outturn of their financial analysis. So it may be that we are making a determination of options at a different time from when they will be making a similar determination. So the prices that we come up with may not be wholly comparable with others on the mainland, but I'll be very happy to provide some comparative analysis, yes.
Councillor Stevens.
Comparators are always used by staff throughout. I know I'm looking over at Mr. Thistlewood. We've been down this route over the years of looking at comparators so that we are in line and in step, and so that we're not overcharging. In actual fact, 9 times out of 10, we undercharge on the on point. And basically, because of the situation we find ourselves in with salaries, etc., 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 and I don't need to go on, but comparators are always used. Thank you.
Thank you all for discussing that in a sensitive manner, because I know it is a very emotive subject for those people that do need to use that service. So thank you. We'll move back on to item A now. Councillor Andre's with us. Outcome of the consultation on the future of Chillerton and Rugby Primary School, which is likely to encourage a little bit of discussion, I would have thought.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your indulgence in changing the order of the agenda around. The statement that was issued by the Alliance Administration went out yesterday. Chair, have the Scrutiny Committee been cited on this? Would it be helpful if I read the statement out, or would you like to go straight into questions?
I think we'll go straight into questions unless
Okay,
anybody
I'm
wants to
happy
say
to do
that. Yeah, straight into questions. So, Councillor Quirk.
This has been going around for a little while now, and recommendations have gone sort of one way and then the other way. During the last year, have the information available actually changed significantly? Has the officer recommendation changed significantly? Are the officers still opposed to the keeping the school open? And how do you justify the educational benefit of maximising the educational benefit for individual children without actually taking into account the cost effectiveness of that education, where you have classes with just one child in?
Thank you for your question, Councillor Quirk. As you rightly allude to, there are many factors that have to be considered. It's fair to say that when I came into post, this was the first major decision that sort of hit my desk, and it was quite clear that at that time, as I think you've also alluded to, the direction of travel was towards closure. The Alliance Administration have committed to keeping local schools for local children. Now, it has to be said that also the government's stance is presumption against closing rural schools. Unfortunately, as you've also alluded to, there is the financial element that the way that schools are currently funded makes it difficult to support that. Having said that, there are glimmers of hope, I think it's fair to say, in the education white paper that has come out, and I think there is some recognition of it. I do regret the time that it has taken to come to this decision, but we needed to be sure as a cabinet that we had looked at every possibility. At the end of the day, this is about the children. This is about children's education. This is about getting it right for our island children, and we were not prepared to rush into a decision. Your other question about whether officers are on board, the first thing that we needed to do was to look at all the evidence before us, which we have, to come to the decision as to whether it was right to go ahead and publish that public notice to amalgamate, which would have led to the closure of the school. We looked at all the possible options, and we have decided to keep that school open and to look, but this isn't just, I would stress, this isn't just about Chillerton and Rookley. This is about looking at a sustainable financial model that delivers high quality education to our island children within the smaller rural schools. And I have to say, the support that I have received from officers has been second to none. I couldn't do this, as you well know, without having officers on board, and I hope that answers your questions.
Mostly, doing it in small rural schools, you have to balance the cost effectiveness of actually keeping that school open, and actually the transport costs of moving them and doing it in a more efficient slightly more concentrated, still rural, but more concentrated manner. Have you done that assessment?
As I've said, the decision was looking at whether a model could be created that would work for smaller rural schools. We are confident that that model exists, and as my statement said, we are working up the options which we will bring back at the earliest opportunity.
As one who's been involved in education for quite a long time, 10 years in a London education committee, 16 years as chair of governors at a secondary school, I'm cynical, I have to say, that you can maintain the number of schools without actually cutting budgets per pupil across the board. And if you cut budgets per pupil across the board, that starts to impact the education of the whole island's children. And I would just advise caution.
Thank you. I take your comments on board, Councillor Quirk, but I can assure you, which is why I said previously, this is not just about Chillerton and Rooking. I can assure you that we are looking at this in the round, and we are well aware that there are impacts we have to look at this as the whole island school, and that is exactly what we're doing. But also, with your experience, we would very much welcome any comments that you want to feed into this. Thank you.
Councillor Payne and then Councillor Robertson.
I'd first like to say thank you to Debbie for, it was us at the Scrutiny Committee the day before Cabinet that requested for the deferral so this decision could be looked at and thought about. So thank you for doing that and listening. And I think it is clear that it needs to be a rural approach for schools and communities is needed, because we saw it in Freshwater where a school closed there. We nearly saw it here in Chillerton and Rookley. So I think it just shows we are very different as an island to Hampshire. Their model is, 400 in a school. We have a few schools like that on the island, but I think it's important to, notice we are very different to Hampshire in that sense. And, in your conversations, have they taken that on board and acknowledged there's a clear difference between us and them here in the way, the rural schools we have?
Thank you for that, Councillor Payne. And yes, as I said, I am working closely with officers. Officers, as my statement says, have been tasked at looking at a model that will work for us on the island, and I'm very grateful to them for the work that they are doing with that. And it's very specific that it has to work for the island, and not only are our schools there for the children, but they are essential parts of our community, and we can't underestimate that. Thank you.
Councillor Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Andre, I know you expressed regret at the time it's taken to make this decision. Since you've been in post, the pupil numbers at the school have gone down from 34 to 15. Do you accept your indecision has contributed to that collapse in pupil numbers?
I accept that uncertainty over the future of a school will inevitably affect parents' choice, and that's how we know our system works. It works on parental choice. Having said that, it was imperative that we took the necessary time to make the right decision, and we feel as a cabinet that we have now made the right decision for a sustainable plan moving forward. Thank you.
In your statement, you said that members of your political group stood on an election pledge of keeping open rural schools. That was a year ago. You wrote to me in February of this year saying you don't agree with the closure of rural schools. Why has it taken so long to make a decision not to close this rural school?
Because we had to be sure that we had a sustainable model moving forward in order to make that decision. And it has taken this time to be sure to explore all of the options. This is not a decision that can be made rashly, because there are significant effects of both decisions. So we had to be sure that we had the evidence and the facts to make the decision.
How many pupils provide a sustainable model?
There isn't one specific model. That's, as I said earlier, we are looking at developing a model that will provide for sustainable, financially sustainable rural schools on this island, an island model.
One more question, if I may, Chair. The Chair of Governors wrote to you in February of this year saying, we haven't felt listened to by you. Do you think the Governors feel listened to by you now?
As I say, we had to consider all possible factors and gather evidence before we made the decision. I appreciate, and I have thanked the head and the governors of the school for their professionalism during that time. We had to gather the evidence. I did meet with the head and the chair of governors as part of this process.
And they're supportive?
We are very early on in this process. Perhaps, Brian, you'd like to come in at this point because you've spoken directly with them since this statement, I think, has been released.
Just before that, can I clarify with Councillor Robertson, would you prefer the school to stay open or close? Because I know Councillor Quirk was more on the area on the side of closing. So just for clarity of the discussion, would you prefer the school open or closed?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware that it was my decision to make. I was doing my job of scrutinising.
Yeah,
but I think
I'm doing my job of scrutinising whether this is the discussion's going. It's just for clarity.
Scrutinising members of the Scrutiny Committee. Okay,
All
right. No, I'm happy to give an answer.
Would you prefer the school to be open?
I think there is a significant wider problem on the island that there are 300 places that are unfilled in primary education, set to rise to 1,500 in 5 years on the current demographics. And I haven't seen anything coming out of the decision-making process around Chillerton and Rookley or anything else in the last year that addresses that. I would like to be part of that conversation, but this is the administration, and I would like to see a wider plan. And if those numbers can be bridged, every school, it would be good to see remain open. But if those numbers can't be bridged, then the inevitable will surely have to happen.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I come
Yeah, of
back on
course,
that,
and then
Chair?
Councillor Quirk. Yeah.
Thank you. Just briefly, this is about providing high quality education for children. But as we know, it's also about that holistic approach of the socio-economic factors that go alongside that. We will, as I said, be bringing a paper back, and I'm more than happy to work with Councillor Robertson if he wants to feed into that. Very happy to work with him. Thank you.
Sorry, I missed Brian. Brian, did you want to add anything?
Place planning is the responsibility of the local authority, which ultimately is determined by elected members. Our job now as officers and the chair of governors and the head teacher will be to make sure that that decision is implemented and that those children continue to get a first class education. So next week I'm meeting with Mark Snow and the chair of governors, and we'll be working out how we sort out the organisation and the day-to-day running of the school to that effect. That's our job as officers, to implement those decisions made by members.
Thank you, Brian. Councillor Quirk.
We've heard a lot about this new model as to how you're going to make it work. I think it would be very valuable for us to put that on our forward plan for the committee, and to actually understand how you can spread the money more thinly, but actually keep enough money in the right places. I'm looking forward to hearing that, because it's a bit of a magic trick I'd like to be able to replicate.
Thank you all. I'll end that there, but I do think taking Councillor Robertson's point into consideration that whilst this is good news for quite a few families and children, there isn't necessarily good news coming further on down the line. So I do think we need to be very mindful of how we approach this, because it isn't possible to. Now I've closed the discussion now, Michael. Thank you for your offer. It isn't possible to keep everyone happy. I will let you, Councillor.
Thank you. I just wanted to actually pick up on something that Councillor Andre, which is we are an island, and we have limited where children can go. We're often imbalanced with, if you would particularly look at developments on the island, where there will be swathes of rural ones with limited population, and then other areas that are actually going to grow in population. And we do need to be innovative and look at new models. We have a duty of care to our family, families, our residents' families and their children. It doesn't fit nicely in a kind of mainland model. So yes, we have got a growing future problem, and we need to actually look at innovative initiatives, right? Now, because then there's an opportunity to do something about it in the future. So I really do welcome this thinking out of the box, because we need to think out of the box on a lot of things, and it also comes down to making sure this government gives us a proper island deal in the future. Thank you.
Can I just come back with one short comment, if I may, just to reassure members that we do actually look at the housing developments coming through as part of our school place planning.
Thank you all for that discussion. Moving on to item 7, we're now into record territory. We've not had a corporate scrutiny meeting that's this long since I started chairing. I realised so. I might have a bit of a rest. So item 7, council constitution, provisions relating to public and member questions. Now, I think people will have quite a lot to say around this, and I'm glad Chris Potts was with us to advise. I don't know, this is an interrogation of 2 meetings that didn't actually happen in the end, so it's not an interrogation of that decision that happened. It's whether we want to change the constitution and how we go about that, and clarify what we want changed. So anyone like to start off with any questions or comments? Councillor Medland.
I understood from a previous meeting that the acting CEO said we would be presented with a new constitution in May to approve, and because of the problem of having multiple versions of constitution and not being clear which dates from 2018 onwards. There's been various updates, and then we have 2 different constitutions on 2 different websites. So there is I understood that was going to be clarified at the annual general meeting.
Yes, and I believe I'll ask Chris Potter, but I think it was if we had anything additional we wanted to might add into that work programme, as it were, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Certainly in relation to Councillor Medland's points, the Constitution is the Constitution as agreed by full Council. The latest changes in April were just merely implementing decisions which have been made by the Council in November last year, and also earlier this year in relation to members' allowances. The fundamental point about the Constitution is quite rightly a living document, and therefore, as an authority which believes in keeping up to date with things and making things relevant, then this sort of fits nicely into the discussion this evening. Now, the situation regarding the Constitution, if I just quickly mention about the annual meeting, as has been mentioned by Councillor Medland quite rightly. The idea in the report which has been published today to members is to seek to engage properly with members on the Constitution, to draw upon the experience members have had since it's in its largely current format came into force in November 2020, and to see what changes people would like to see, particularly in the way of clarification, but not exclusively that. Also in terms of treatment of a whole document approach with appropriate cross-referencing, because again, I think we have a snagging list which we keep when people raise issues, etc., as part of best practice reviews. And part of that has obviously revealed that part of the Constitution, if you read in isolation, can be misleading because there are other bits of the Constitution. So that's why I'm talking about a whole document and appropriate cross-referencing, which nicely brings me into the situation regarding one of the issues which has been recently raised, which is the right of members of the public to ask questions at Cabinet meetings. Part 2, Section 6 Constitution, for those who are anorexics like myself, detail the right of members of the public to ask questions at Cabinet meetings. And to illustrate what I've just said, if you look at Part 4B of the Constitution, you've got a similar rule along those same lines. Both rules are actually qualified in the sense of the right of members of the public to ask questions only applies to ordinary Cabinet meetings, not to extraordinary Cabinet meetings, I should say. Now, should members wish to change that so that the right of members of the public to ask questions apply to all Cabinet meetings, then that is something which can be looked at by members and therefore eventually form part of the recommendations to full council. By way of illustration of how complicated things can be, and obviously my job is to make things easy, I would have to qualify that in the sense of you could not build in an automatic right for members of the public to ask questions at Cabinet during private session. The reason I say that is because Parliament, which is obviously the greatest democratic authority, through legislation, has said that attendance during a private session of a Cabinet meeting is by invitation only, by invitation of the Cabinet. And again, one of the matters looking at the Constitution, one of the bits talks about committees, and obviously the Cabinet is not a committee, but if members of the public, when they asked to read that, they would take that as almost the guarantee for even members of the council can attend as of right, etc. Now, that was one of the major issues raised recently about the right of members of the public to ask questions. So that's the current situation. The procedural rules agreed and currently operating do not allow that to happen. It can be changed, and that's a matter for members, as I say, to consider the ins and outs on that. That's the first item. If you wish me to continue, I can move on to the second item, or was there
I'll take a question from Councillor Spink and then we'll come. Is that okay, Chris? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Potter, I've looked at the Constitution, and I don't claim to be an expert on the Constitution, but I can't see any provision in the Constitution for an extraordinary meeting of Cabinet. Is there such a provision?
If you allow, I think I didn't want on mic again, but thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Spink. The provision, in actual fact, is in parliamentary legislation. It stems from the fact of the Local Government Act 2000, and for the benefit, particularly members of the public listening tonight. This local authority, like many authorities up and down the country, operate a leader and cabinet executive system, which basically means that some functions are dealt with by council and some functions by cabinet. And one of the fundamental points to get across to people being introduced to the system in the very beginning is to explain that there is this demarcation out between functions and who has responsibility for all types of functions. And the Local Government Act 2000 says that if anything's not actually written down, then by default it goes as an executive responsibility. And under the same act, the leader of the council has full powers to make decisions in relation to executive matters. There are a couple of exceptions which aren't really relevant for tonight, but basically to do with joint arrangements. But again, it's another illustration. There's a lot of detail hiding behind this, but I stress that things can be achieved so that the desired outcomes can be actually delivered. So yes, the leader of the cabinet can decide their schedule of meetings. Scheduled meetings were decided, but as members will recall, in relation to the draft island planning strategy, it was thought appropriate to call an extraordinary council meeting, and prior to that, as has been mentioned already this evening, then you would need a cabinet meeting and you'd need a corporate scrutiny meeting. And the matters in hand were very much for the meeting which didn't take place with cabinet, but the intention of that meeting was to enable the cabinet to fulfill its statutory obligation of making recommendations to cabinet to full council from cabinet as to what that draft island strategy should look like, and then it would go on to full council for all members of full council to consider what the cabinet would at that stage have formally recommended for approval. It's important, and it has been raised, and I think it's rightly been raised, the importance of public consultation in such a significant strategy which would affect will affect the island for many years to come. There are specific statutory arrangements which many will be aware under the regulations, the Regulation 18 with public consultation, which members will be aware has been undertaken, and that's a starting point, it's not a finish point. So lots of opportunities for the public to be engaged, and also to stress that once cabinet actually has made its recommendations, it's only cabinet which can make those recommendations, then you have a firm document upon which to put to full council and indeed members of the public to further engage into what they believe should be in that particular strategy. Thank you.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, Councillor Spink, please do. And then Councillor John.
I don't want to elongate this discussion longer than is absolutely necessary, Mr. Potter, but I had understood that the cabinet meeting was to be an extraordinary meeting, but that it was then discovered that there was no provision in the Constitution to allow that, and it in fact took place as an ordinary cabinet meeting and is so described as that on its agenda. And I recall, for example, it going in my electronic diary by staff as an extraordinary cabinet meeting, and then it became a cabinet meeting. So I think it is important that we establish whether that meeting you say was an extraordinary meeting or a normal meeting of cabinet, because there's no right, as I understand it, to exclude public questioning or members' written questions from ordinary meetings of council. And those two things were excluded. And I think as a council, we need to know whether that was done constitutionally or not.
Chris.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Spink. The meeting which did not eventually take place would have been, in my view, an extraordinary cabinet meeting, and therefore it would have, under the existing constitutional rules, would have prevented members of the public from being able to ask questions under the procedural rules. Dealing with the valid point raised by Councillor Spink in terms of member questions, etc., if that meeting had continued to take place, then the Part 4B, Section 14, in terms of members' questions, Members have a right to ask questions of a strategic policy nature, and also to take part in the discussion on a particular item prior to the vote. So if you hold that thought in one's mind at the moment, then you also have, in many occasions, but not in this one, in many occasions you have a generalised agenda item, members' questions. Now, the purpose of an agenda, and this is really particularly for people outside the room without being patronising, that the whole point of an agenda is that people have advance notice of what is going to be discussed at a particular meeting. Now, sometimes there can be difficulties in terms of interpretation of the parameters of what is due to be discussed at a particular meeting. In this case, obviously, there was, leaving aside, approval of minutes and declaration of interest, etc. Primarily, the whole idea of the extraordinary 3 meetings, if you like, was to discuss a substantively single item, i.e. the draft planning island strategy. And therefore, I would have found it totally inconceivable if Cabinet had taken place without members being able to ask questions in pursuant of the rules in Part 4B on the item on the agenda, and by looking at the report by the relevant Cabinet member, the report clearly sort of gives the parameters of the agenda item as being looking at the recommendations to put forward to full council. Again, one of the ANARAC bits to mention is that in order to ensure that the public and everybody else has the advance notification of agenda items, then whether it's Cabinet or whether it's full council, unless a particular thing is on an agenda, then there can be no consideration of it. So moving things forward, then one would very much be engaging with members in the constitutional process to see whether or not it would be the wish of members to ensure that there is a generalised agenda item for members' questions wherever that is legally possible. Again, being an ANARAC on it, in terms of full council, if any 5 members were to requisition the holding of an extraordinary council meeting, then one of the delightful schedules under the 72 Act says that the only business that can be transacted is the business which is called for by those 5 council members. Now, one would hope that if that were to be ever the case in the future, that members might, those 5 members might want to include a generalised agenda item for members' questions. But the reason I'm labouring the point is that even in the forthcoming constitutional review, would not be the gift of this authority to demand an agenda item in those particular circumstances. But the whole mood of this meeting, if I've read it right, and throughout many weeks and months, is properly engaging with the public, letting people have that appropriate forum to be involved. I think sometimes the language over many decades up and down the country can not be helpful in terms of we have a representative democracy, quite rightly. We don't have a fully participatory democracy akin to the Athenian model, simply because life is very complicated and we have a representative democracy, so individuals can devote time to public service and to actually acquire the relevant knowledge in order to make informed decision making, and leave a lot of other people, if they don't want to be involved, to get on and deal with their lives. But I do stress it's very important for the health of democracy that people do feel able to participate, if I put sort of commas round, because we exist to provide a better community for all. Thank you.
Chair, I still have some questions.
Yeah.
Chair, do you think it right, perhaps as chair, and I'm sorry to ask you this, but do you think it right, perhaps as chair, to ask Mr. Potter to answer the questions as fully as he feels necessary, but to refrain from making long speeches, because this is a very important matter. I have a number of questions. My questions are short and to the point. Mr. Potter's answer are long and not to the point, and we'll be here till 9 o'clock tonight if he goes on in this way. And my patience is running out.
Okay, Councillor Spink, point taken. I think in terms of summarising where I think Mr. Potter or Chris has taken us, is that anything that's not in the written constitution is the responsibility of the executive by default. That questions at special meetings, including cabinet and corporate scrutiny and full council, aren't the gift of the council, as it were, this local authority. Without change the constitution, even then that is not entirely guaranteed. So what other questions do you have, Councillor Spink?
Well, Mr. Potter, you've sought to show, if I've understood it correctly, that the democratic process would not have been adversely affected had the cabinet meeting taken place, because although there wasn't an item, an agenda item for questions, there is a provision in the constitution to allow verbal or oral questions. The concern that I have, though, is that members' written questions were refused, and they were refused by you. And in reply to Councillor Chris Quirk's written question, you said this: the agenda for Thursday's cabinet meeting agreed by the leader of cabinet, that's Councillor Pacey Wilcox, who's here, the leader of the PC, I'm sorry. I think perhaps we could concentrate on the more important points, Councillor Stevens, but there it is. I apologise for mispronouncing the leader's name.
It means a lot to people,
Carry on, Councillor.
Soon becoming faster in this meeting, really. I'm going to read your question again, if I may. The agenda for your answer, this is your answer to Councillor Quirk's written question on an issue that is going to determine planning policy for 15 years, subject to 5-year reviews. The agenda for Thursday's cabinet meeting, agreed by the leader of cabinet, does not have questions by councillors for cabinet on it. And so democratic services are unable to give effect to your desire to ask the question below. The Constitution states on page 21 that cabinet meeting agendas are determined by the leader in consultation with relevant chief officers. I would like to know, please, why, if you were one of the relevant chief officers, Councillor Quirk's written question was denied. And I would like you to tell me, please, in a number of sentences, not a chapter.
I think we'll concentrate on getting an answer, but if you can be brief, Chris, that would be appreciated. I do think we've gone over this ground before, and I don't want this to be more of an interrogation because
I don't know the answer. I wouldn't ask you if I did.
No, the point 7 on the agenda wasn't for it to be an interrogation, Councillor Spink. I know you're very keen to find the answer, which I would recommend that you make yourself part of any working group that goes forward on changing the constitution, because you certainly have a knowledge and a passion for it greater than mine. But if you could, if you could, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, to recap what I've already explained this evening to the committee, there are parameters within an agenda item. The agenda item, which was due to be discussed by the Cabinet, was to formulate and agree its recommendations on the draft island strategy. There were 2 sets of written questions which were submitted, and Councillor Spink has referred to that. They were not rejected by me as monitoring officer. They were rejected by operation of law. Again, you'll recall I carefully explained to the committee that unless something is on the agenda, then it cannot, by law, be considered. Now, again, I mentioned there's always the issue of interpretation. Both sets of questions, which were legitimate questions, are not sort of attacking the questions, or indeed those people asking the legitimate questions. As the Council's monitoring officer, I have a duty to advise and uphold the law. And basically, the two questions were largely to do with legitimate concerns about future parliamentary intention as to a potential white paper in September, October, which might change things. And also questions were asked that should the draft island strategy be eventually approved, etc., once it has been approved, how would the as unyet specified changes in legislation, how would that impact the Council's position on the island strategy? Those are very astute questions, and questions which do demand an answer, but as there was no specific agenda item for members' questions, then under the existing rules in the Constitution, questions have to relate to a particular agenda item, and the agenda item is local to this island in terms of the draft planning strategy. And also in answer to the other point, I cannot give any more information regarding the lead up to that decision. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll leave that there. I think that the discussion around the change of the Constitution should be along the lines of the questions you asked Councillor Spink, and I would very much appreciate if you made yourself available to be part of those decisions, the changes.
I would like to be part of it, and I have to say, Chair, and I think it's a comment, but I have to say that the closing down of public questions, or the intended closing down of public questions and members' questions, and answers to members' questions, because if one asks a question under Mr. Potter's provision of the Constitution, you're not entitled to an answer at the meeting. So the closing down, the whole point, the whole procedure of the draft plan was as follows. It was served on corporate scrutiny with 5 days' notice. 2 days after that, it was proposed to go before full cabinet, and a week or thereabouts after that, it was to go to full council. Public questioning was stopped at cabinet. Members' written questions were stopped at cabinet, and there was to be no public questions or councillors' questions at full council. And that to me is a very disturbing development, and that's why I'm somewhat angry about it. That's a very disturbing element of an erosion of democracy on an extremely important point. And the answers that I've had to my questions tonight from Mr. Potter do not answer my fears. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think, to be fair to Chris, and I'm not here to defend or attack anyone. I don't know enough about the decision-making process. What I understand from the legal point is Chris Potter didn't decide the constitution of this council. So I don't think it would be fair, if it wouldn't matter who the monitoring officer was, I don't think it would be fair to name them as the source of the blame for this, and that will end that.
Well, I think I must be permitted to answer that, because I don't agree that that's the correct interpretation of the Constitution, and when I'm on the committee, we'll sort that out.
I will. I'm going to end that there, I'm afraid. But no, and I appreciate you putting yourself forward, Councillor Spink. I look forward to your recommendations. So thank you for that. But I do agree. This shouldn't be aimed at an individual, because an interpretation, your interpretation will be different to mine, and I don't think it's fair for us to level any of the where we got to with the monitoring officer, because it could be any monitoring officer in the country. Staff don't decide the constitution, we do, and we'll leave it there.
We'll have to, Chair, we'll have to agree to disagree on that. Indeed. Because I don't accept that the Constitution rules out answer to questions by simply excluding it as an item agenda. That would be a very dangerous thing for the Constitution to allow.
So I know you will have read the recommendations from the committee report. Item 4 is that members of the Scrutiny Committee note the proposal for further constitutional amendments to be undertaken to remove any ambiguity that exists within the current constitution in relation to member and public questions, and are set out in this report that is to be initiated by way of recommendation in the Monitoring Officer's Report to Annual Council on the 18th of May. So that's where we are. So thank you. Thanks, Paul. Right.
Sorry, Chair, may I just ask, will therefore the protocol committee, whatever one wants to call it, to look at the changes to the constitution, will that meet prior to our next meeting in May so that we can report back?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think the chief executive's looking at the constitutional changes and asking for input from members.
Right.
So I think that's how it'll work. I don't think it's going to be a meeting, but I think it's going to be quite live and via direct conversation.
My concern is this, is that if that is to be the standard interpretation of the constitution, will there be further meetings before the amendments can be made at which public questioning and councillors' questioning is closed down?
I think, from what I understand from the recommendation, is that we take away the ambiguity of not allowing members of the public.
Will that ambiguity be taken away?
By their recommendation is to discuss them in the main meeting, is it not? Sorry, yeah.
On corporate scrutiny?
No, council, full council.
Well, I don't see how it's going to be discussed at full council.
I think the idea will be a recommendation. I will let Claire tell us, because Claire will know a little bit more.
Thank you, and hopefully I don't break up in the process. And I thank you for the lively debate, and it's obviously something that's very important and dear to members' hearts. I guess from my perspective, the important point to make here is the Constitution is owned by the Council, and it is there and agreed by each of the councillors that sit on this council, and it's there. Obviously within constraints in terms of the law, that has to have certain elements contained within it, but ultimately it is for the members to determine what the constitution sets out in terms of its procedural rules and any other matters that are required for the constitution. The recommendation from the monitoring officer to full council is that there is clearly an issue here that members are keen to clarify, and we are aware, as he also mentioned, that we have a bit of a snag list, that as things occur, there are things that have been put down on a list for reconsideration as to what our future constitution needs to address. So the intention would be that that working group of councillors would seek to address those issues and make the constitutional changes where that's legally possible to do so, can be made and then put forward to full council as a recommendation for further adoption. And I think it's really important to make that point. It's not owned by officers, it's owned by the council, and it is there to serve the council well.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you all. Moving on to any members' questions at all.
Just to remind you, I was the next one after Councillor.
I know, but I decided to close it down, Chris, if we've gone on long enough, but please, if you're brief.
Yes, so the good news is I only wrote down 13 questions arising from Chris Potter's answers. I did, documented. I will only choose one of those, which is that I think your summary, Chair, was very good in terms of what that really interpretation of the answer was. But I do think that we need to be very mindful of the need for public scrutiny as well as internal scrutiny within all of the committees. And I think we should make sure that nothing occurs that endangers that public access to any of the committees that we serve on.
Absolutely, we're all here to represent the residents of the island, and I think every time we should say, does this offer value to residents of the island, whatever it is we decide. So thank you for that. Members' questions? Any questions at all? Oh, I thought you put your hand up then, Councillor Stevens. I got ever so slightly disappointed. Anything at all? If not, I'll let you all free to go back into the wild. Thank you all for a lively debate. Thank you all for showing each other respect, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.